Welcome back to another episode of Tales from the Trenches. We take our peer group stories from the week and turn it into something that we can teach back to everybody that potentially wants to watch this podcast. So my name is Adam Hanneman. I happen to run the peer groups at PAX 8. With me, as always, is Natalie Hell. And Natalie is the basically the second in command in all things peer group. She's been in the industry for a long time. Thanks for hopping on the call today, Natalie.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
So what we're talking about today is really all about triage and dispatch. And for the purposes of our conversation today, we're just going to use the term dispatch. Understand that we actually mean triaging and then dispatching the ticket, right? Because it's a really important thing. When we think about triage and dispatch as a process, the first thing you need to do is triage all the tickets that come in to make sure that you understand the priorities of everything before you start farming out the work to your people or your person or whatever that looks like. So the triage and dispatch process is a really critical thing, at least in our opinion. And so we're going to just kind of call it dispatch the rest of our conversation today to save some syllables and also just to make it a little bit easier to describe. So Natalie, let's start with the ideas around why we think triage and dispatch are so important.
So part of it is consistency, prioritization as far as urgent and impact. So if you are not, or if a company is looking at something and they're not getting the whole picture, then how can you properly align that to your service department? And I say service department, it could be 2 people, it could be 20 people.
Sure.
But part of it is you have to know when you start your day what's urgent, what's important, all of those things. And if you don't have a true dispatch process, things can get missed. People get cranky. I put my ticket in and no one's looked at it and it was urgent. So it's just really important to have a global thought process around the dispatch in your company. And like I said, it could be one person, it could be 20 people, it could be 100. And it evolves throughout that.
Yeah, I think the other piece too is I like to think of that your dispatch process sets the ticket up for success. No matter, and it doesn't really matter who's dispatching. It could be a dispatcher, it could be you, the owner, it could be the service manager, it could be whomever. It doesn't really matter who. It doesn't really matter who's doing that piece of the work, but doing that well and having a real solid process for that sets the ticket up for success. It sets the client up for success, and it sets the technician up for success so that whomever is working the ticket, it doesn't have to do a whole bunch of reading the tea leaves or rubbing their belly, patting their head to figure out what's going on with the tickets. For me, that's one of the more important pieces.
Well, and the other part is it's also that first step in, really evaluating the situation. Is it billable? Is it not billable? Should this even go to service? Should this be a project? What do I need an extra conversation with the client? That first step in that process is just, like you said, it's extremely important. And you have to have a process for that process.
Absolutely. And the couple of things that kind of usually come out when we think about the dispatch process is things like ticket budgets and making sure that the right level tech is working on a thing, right? You don't want your level ones working on level 3 stuff, and you definitely don't want your level 3s doing a bunch of password resets. They will probably be happy to do one because if a thing needs to get done, your level 3s are probably going to take care of whatever it is, but you don't want to be handing a bunch of password resets to your level 3s unless you don't want them to work for you for very long. So it's really important to understand what's going on in the scope of the ticket and get whatever that ticket is to the right people to get it solved quickly and as efficiently as possible. So then let's talk a little bit about some of the different, like how your dispatch role evolves over time, right? Because when you very first start your MSP, it's you get an email in and you just deal with whatever it is as they come in, and usually you don't get more than 2 or 3 tickets at once, and maybe not even more than 2 or 3 tickets in a day. So you can pretty much figure that out as you go. But as you grow a little bit and you get a couple texts, Natalie, what do you think? Let's talk through what we think that dispatch process might look like, through the stages of a company's growth, at least for some of the early stages anyway.
So for me in that early stage, that 1 to 5, where it's probably the owner and admin, maybe the one tech that handles it, it's really, for me, it's about not the documentation. It's about knowing how it's handled. Whether you have a PSA, you're doing it on a spreadsheet, you're doing a shared mailbox. Those are common at that stage, any of those, just depending on your MSP. there still needs to be some sort of accountability to who is doing it. So it needs to be kind of well thought out, like so and you check the mailbox, the shared mailbox every 10 minutes for tickets to come in, or hey, you document it in your spreadsheet, like this person is assigned to this ticket. If it's just the owner, it's more of making sure it's just still documented,
Hmm.
whether you have a PSA or your shared mailbox or your own email that you're working out of. It's just important to make sure that somebody still owns the process of how that's happening.
Well, and the other piece is making sure that you don't get tickets that are like lost in the
Mhm.
proverbial black hole, right? And having someone that's paying attention to all of the work coming in and making sure that all of that work is getting done, whether it's the owner as a solopreneur or whether it's a couple techs, making sure that you're not leaving work
Mhm.
untouched is important as well. And I think that's kind of where the PSA usually comes in, right? Usually you get a couple techs working for you, and the working out of an email box works for a while, but it doesn't work for very long, especially as you have more techs and more tickets coming in. And when you hire a tech or two, usually your workload kind of ramps up a little bit
Mhm.
because you've got some people. And this is where you can lose tickets in the couch cushions. So having a really solid process for kind of how to pay attention to that stuff is important.
Yeah, I commonly see that struggle in the smaller MSPs that do use that shared mailbox or don't have a true process where maybe they have it's just the owner and a couple of techs or an owner and you know one tech that one and it happens even in peer groups, right? In any MSP, the other person always assumes that the other one got it
Right.
or that two people are CC'd on an email, so both people are like, oh well, the other one's getting it. And 9 times out of 10, the other person is thinking the same thing. And so it kind of gets it that communication is key. If you're going to do it that way, you have to have some record of, hey, this is how we mark off we've addressed it. This is what we're doing. And it is, and I say dispatch at that stage, it still has to be a process. A lot of people think, oh, I don't have a dispatcher. It's not about having a person, it's the role within an MSP. So it's not
Hmm.
like a person's job title at that point. It's the role still has to get done no matter what size company.
100%. And the other thing too is that if you don't have a process defined at all, and everyone just kind of it's a free for all,
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard to, especially as you grow and the larger your company gets, if you don't have a process built for something, it's a whole lot harder to build a process for a representatively larger company. So you might as well start with a good enough process for wherever you happen to be and use that as a stepping stone for leveling that up as you go. So let's think about MSP's got, two, three, four, five techs somewhere in there, and they have a PSA at this point. We talk a little bit, in the peer groups about self-dispatch, which is a thing that kind of happens usually around this stage, and sometimes as you get a little bit bigger too. Let's talk a little bit about self-dispatch, right? So a ticket comes in, and you've got four or five techs. What are some of the maybe the pros and the cons of self-dispatch?
So I think at that stage, the cons, right, is the cherry picking. It happens in almost every MSP. Some people cherry pick, and it leads to, the easy things done first, probably by the tech that doesn't need to be doing them, and you're not necessarily hitting the urgent and critical at that point. They're just skimming through and saying, oh, I can knock that out real quick, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that should be knocked out right then.
Right.
And then there's no real true priority or accountability at that point. It's kind of a free for all. It's like the Lord of the Flies, if you've ever read the book. It's everybody's
Hmm.
on the island and nobody's in charge. And that's what happens and you might have one tech working 20 tickets and one tech working 5 because that's what was left. So there's no balance there. Pros of having self dispatch is that you still have to be able to have somebody that's setting the priorities of the tickets and making sure that they're getting hit, which leads back to that you still need someone looking at the bigger picture.
Right. I think the pro is also sort of the con, right? So if we think about the Lord of the Flies aspect of it, sometimes that's a desirable thing, especially at smaller MSPs, largely because people like seem to kind of rankle under the idea of there's too much process, or we're becoming too
Yeah.
corporate or whatever, and which I usually chuckle about. But the reality is that the benefit of not having a dispatch person by having a dispatch process is that
Yep.
it's still a little bit more free for all, and you kind of like it that way. Well, the problem is that that doesn't scale very well. And anybody that tells me that we don't have a cherry picking issue, one, I usually call BS, but two, even if maybe that's the case, that means you don't have a cherry picking issue yet. You
Yeah.
will eventually have a cherry picking issue. We tried doing sort of a self dispatch model at a pretty large size at a former MSP that I worked at, and, cherry picking was a real problem. Oh, I don't like that person. I'm not picking the ticket up.
Hmm.
Oh, that ticket looks a little bit ugly. I'm going to see if somebody else picks it up first. And what would happen is that these tickets that were like pretty important tickets were sitting at the top of the queue, and I would see them as a service manager or whatever my title was, and I was like, "Hey, team, what's up with this one?" And usually it would be like the teacher in school when they ask a question to the class and everyone's like trying to look away and like not make eye contact with the teacher. It's like, guys, come on, like, can you just fix this thing? Can you just go jump in and deal with it? And we quickly ran into surmised the idea that trying to do this self dispatch at our size, which was, I don't know, we probably had 10 people on the help desk. It it was pretty much awful in most of the ways at that point.
I was on the way back from peer group in Chicago, sitting on the airport floor with hotel papers, building my dispatch process. Because after going to peer group, realizing, man, this could be so much easier if we just had something in place. Because we
Mhm.
had a person that kind of put stuff on the right boards or moved it here or moved it there. What it showed us, it's also kind of a pro. You learn what techs are hungry and what techs want to jump in,
Sure.
which can be great at that size, that 6 to 10 person, where you start realizing who are the emerging leaders or who is the emerging tech because they're hopping on the hard things on purpose. But after that, after 10 people, it gets really rough and you have to lock it down a little bit. And there's always a little pushback, but it's really about efficiency at that point.
So then let's talk about like the next evolution of the role. Your MSP may skip the whole self-dispatch side of the world, which is fine by me, honestly. But the next side of the world is really you hire a dispatch person and they do all of the incoming calls, and they take care of all of the incoming tickets, and they get those things set up and they get handed off. Now, we'll talk a minute in a minute about having techs answer phone calls, and we'll kind of loop back to that here in just a minute. But let's talk a little bit about the benefits, maybe the pros and the cons of having a what I would like to call a non-technical dispatch person just kind of handling all of the ticket intake. So Natalie, what do you think the kind of talking points are? Pros, cons, or somewhere in the middle around having a dispatcher kind of take all of the incoming things.
Yeah. So part of the pro is that you have one person that you can ask questions to, or one or two people. At that point, it's usually one. But you end up starting to gain that scheduling efficiency. You get the tickets to the right person, the right tech the first time. You tend to see your first response or your first touch closure rate go up because that person is starting to see, hey, that tech has fixed this multiple times and I know he can do it. You start to see that SLAs are a little bit more consistent. Maybe not, you're not driving to the SLAs yet, but you're definitely seeing more consistency, right? Definitely some cons that I've experienced and seen in other peer groups is making sure that, when you have one person doing it, they're going to go on vacation. And how do you handle that? They're going to be sick one day. So who's the backup, and not having that really aligned. But also that the other part is that person starts learning those customers very well.
Hmm.
And that is valuable because they can tell you, oh, off the top of their head, oh yeah, they've had 10 tickets and this is their main problem. And you're just really capitalizing on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like the thought around having one person in charge of incoming tickets, because that person is going to intuitively know if that client's been calling about the same thing over and over and over again, and this is the thing that needs to be dealt with. Now, on the flip side, maybe if you have multiple dispatchers, or if your techs take a bunch of calls, your techs routinely, now I'm not saying every tech does this or it's always this case, but the techs, at least that I've worked with in my career, are much more likely to jump in and start solving the issue versus listening to what the issue is and thinking, hey, I wonder if this has been an issue for a while, or I wonder if they've been having a number of tickets, unless that tech happened to have been working those other tickets. And so one of the areas where the dispatch process can be helpful is, especially if you're using a non-technical dispatch person, they can actually ask questions, because they don't just go right into problem solving mode. They're in the discovery, curious about the issue mode, and they pull up the previous tickets from that user or maybe that company, because that's just part of the process, and they get good at that part of it. And it could be a really beneficial thing for the overall health of that client relationship too, right? Because your clients, when they call in, if they're calling in about the same thing over and over again, or emailing about the same thing over and over again, and you guys are just like solving the symptoms, but you're not fixing the core issue, that will eventually irritate a client. Now, that's not to say you'll never figure it out if you have a dispatcher. But the short version of it is that in my experience, and what I've seen in the peer groups, is that the companies that have a dispatcher usually suss those issues out faster than the ones who don't have that person doing it. So let's shift and talk a little bit about the ideas around maybe having a dispatcher, but your techs answer the phones. Because I know a lot of MSPs really prefer the idea of having a tech answer the phone. Now, you can go 16 different ways on this. I could take or leave that as a concept. A number of MSPs that I talk to, they have a dispatch person, but they also have a tech answering phones, or techs answering phones. So Natalie, what do you think about that as a concept? What have you seen? What have you seen from the peer groups or your own experience?
So I think that when you're smaller, it's easier, right? Um, but what we found is when we hit about, I don't know, probably about eight techs, give or take, a few on the help desk, multiple tier twos, and they actually came to us and asked us to figure out. They didn't want to answer phones anymore.
Sure.
So what they realized is that every time they get interrupted, if the client was like, "Well, you're already a tech, you can fix it," there wasn't that priority. They were in the middle of working something, they get the next call, they have to stop this ticket, then they have to go over here and work this ticket, and then they have to go back to this ticket, and they kept going back and forth. So
Sure, sure.
that is one of those things that I just saw over and over again, was that, you know, your brain has to jump back into the previous thought process, and that myth of multitasking. No, that's out of your brain. Now you're fixing this. Okay, well, great. Now I have to go back and figure out, where was I, what step was I on, and all of these things, which doesn't go away completely. But when you're the tech answering the phone, or the text answering phone, it's constant interruption.
Yes, that context switching is a problem, right? That
Yeah.
that that back and forth. One of the things I'm a fan of, if you're going to have a tech answering the phone, is I would put a low level tech answering the phone, or
Hmm.
maybe a couple of them, and they get to do like one of three things, or maybe one of four things, right? They can do password resets, they can do a new user, they can do a user termination, maybe like some group membership stuff, but really basic stuff. And then absent those four things, then they can create a ticket and escalate. Then basically your dispatcher. And then maybe you layer things on, right? Maybe you say, okay, you've graduated past these four things. Here's your fifth thing or sixth thing, or like some of those other things. But if you're going to answer the phone, especially if your phones are relatively busy, meaning you get several calls in an hour, having a tech working a larger, harder issue to solve, and then having to answer the phones is nightmare fuel for them, probably, because they're, to your point, they're going to be having the context switch between the thing that they're like, eye deep in trying to figure the thing out, and then all of a sudden you have a call, and then they have to like pause what they're doing and come back. So yeah, I'm a fan, if you're going to have techs answering the phones, especially as you've grown a little bit, that you have some version of a junior tech, tier one, tier point
Point five.
0.5 or something like that, answering the phones and doing some of that stuff. For the same reasons, I also would suggest having a non-technical dispatch person. Having technical dispatch person, I found one of a couple things to be true. One, they try to solve the problem versus dispatch the ticket, which they get pulled into other things, and then all of a sudden the next call comes in, and they can't answer the second call because they're still busy trying to fix the first call. That's only going to take a couple minutes, but that's not really the case usually, or at least sometimes. And then the other piece is they want to move up and they want to do more stuff and get beyond this dispatchy kind of work, because if you're a technician, doing dispatch work long term is probably not really in your happy place. So, it's this transient thing in that role which becomes a problem. I'm a fan of hiring a non-technical dispatcher and paying them well and let them really rock it out and just do a great job in that role. And I don't care if you're paying them more than some of your techs, especially if they're setting your techs up for success. A good dispatcher can be a force multiplier in your team. What has your experience been around technical versus non-technical dispatch now?
I'm going to be the out of the norm. We actually went against best practices where we didn't have tech. Ours were quasi tech. That's the best way to explain it. So our dispatchers, we had three at the time, but we had one like every day just dedicated to triage, so to speak, desk just dispatching, right? They all three answered, or majority, two of them answered the phone the majority of the time. The other one was more playing the Tetris game. But we actually used dispatch to vet our like potential tier ones that, or like maybe they're green right out of college.
Sure.
Um, and they know, like, they have a computer science degree, but they have no real world experience. And so we would be like, hey, we're going to start you in dispatch, and you learn all the customers, and you learn all that. And then we had our dispatchers doing the ad change moves. So they could password reset. They could make a new user because they didn't have to necessarily have the client on the phone, and they could terminate a user. We added a couple things here and there, but what we found is the ones that started in dispatch and moved up to tier one and then maybe to tier two, they were much more respectful of the process of dispatch and how it the why it was so important because they'd been through it, but they also knew all the customers by then. So it was a
Sure.
good way for us to check. Also, it was a good way for us to know if they could de-escalate a situation.
Oh yeah.
And so we kind of used that as a jumping point. Hey, be in dispatch for a while, then you can move up. And we did have just one dispatcher that stayed the whole time. But the rest of them, we kind of used it as that jumping stone into the next the next tier one. So kind of had them ready. Now that's not necessarily what's considered best practice, but it worked for us at the time. But the one dispatcher that stayed for the longest, he didn't want to necessarily be tech. He liked this part. And we purposely hired somebody that could de-escalate customer service skills. We picked people at that point just for their skill of de-escalation and customer service. And if they wanted to be tech later, we would train them. So we kind of hybrided it.
Yeah, I like that your experience there was different than mine and what some of the other things I've seen, mostly because I think it's pretty clear that there isn't like one best practice. There's a number of things you can do well, and I think the key behind it, and I think the key behind most things, is that if you put some deliberate thought and energy behind building a process, and then some deliberate thought and energy behind growing your team and helping them level up their skill set, you can solve a lot of just different issues that you may run into. And you heard it, as we've been talking, is that, I'm a non-technical dispatch person, and Natalie, you are sort of a technical dispatch person, and it's worked for you. So there's a number of ways to take a peek at it. I've always been a fan of hiring people who've done dispatch work elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
or that type of work. So for a while, we had a dispatcher that was sort of the host at a restaurant where their job was basically a dispatch person. You're trying to like get people to different tables and whatnot, and having to deal with the general public and all that. There's a certain skill set that's there. We hired somebody who was a 911 dispatcher that burnt out over that. And for the most part, no one's dying on an MSP ticket. So while you had a stressful role, the person was pretty like, hey, this is pretty low key for us. And we're like, oh, wow, that's not what we were expecting to hear, but cool. And school teachers and people who deal with like lots of things, especially lots of like little things left and right, are people who are naturally pretty good at this type of thing. And I think for me, you're looking for someone who's fairly organized. What else would you think about if you're trying to hire a dispatcher, Natalie?
For us, when I think about who I want to hire, punctuality and time management skills are key.
Mm-hmm.
They're playing a giant game of Tetris. They have to be able to global think and they have to be able to look at the big picture. So they could be looking at 6 texts, they could be looking at 20 texts, and they got to be able to kind of see through the trees because there's always fires, there's always something, and they have to be able to. It's like the unsung position. They're telling everybody what to do, but none of the power to do it. And so they have to really have that teamwork. They have to be able to foster that teamwork skill because, like I said, they're telling all the techs, hey, you need to hit this ticket. You're doing this next. This is your job. Blah 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 blah.
Right.
They have no authority to do it. They're not their manager. They're not reporting. They're just hoping that everybody is kumbaya and listens to them. So I really look for someone who likes teamwork. They're not necessarily like if I asked them, do you rather do a project with somebody or by themselves? And they're like, I hate group projects. Probably not the best fit. They could have half and half, but they have to somewhat like working with people. Somebody that's personable. They need to be able to have conversations with everybody on the other side of the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to have de-escalation skills. They have to be able to say, hey, this was a hard time at this, and like I said, restaurant or wherever we hire from, they have to have some sort of ability to de-escalate and have an example of when they do it. And that was really what we hired for, culture, and we hired for those skills. And then get to work. Like, if your main weakness is I'm never on time, I don't want you at dispatch.
And that kind of comes back to the organizational skills and kind of like, being ready to go is that's all part of the same thing. One of the things I like to think about when I was working with our dispatchers and our dispatch process and those kinds of things is I tried to have our dispatchers, and this is the thing I talk to MSPs about all the time, is trying to manage to zero. I want to give a dispatcher just a few metrics to pay attention to, right? Obviously you're paying attention to the ticket board, whatever that looks like, but you also have a few things that you're trying to manage to zero. And for us, it was always like the tickets in the dispatch view, and then like long running tickets or tickets that need attention, because I wanted my dispatcher to like look at all the tickets, not just the incoming stuff, making sure
Uh-huh.
kind of their job was sort of almost service manager light to a degree, where they were trying to make sure that things weren't getting stuck and that people were kind of doing the thing, whatever their job happened to be, that they were moving things forward. What were some of the things that you asked your dispatcher to manage to or do?
Yes, we had four. Um, so needs attention needed to be zero before the end of the day. We didn't want anything that was needs attention needed to be left till the next morning because the next morning all they're going to do is be triaging and dispatching all the stuff that comes in. So they need to handle that. No tickets that are not. We did schedule to zero. Like, let's get them all scheduled, even if we're scheduling them out 2 or 3 days,
Mm-hmm.
or at least ready to schedule. So through that first process of setting up for success. So we had one that's like no tickets on the triage board. At the end of the day when they left, there shouldn't be anything there. We did no tickets in progress. So at the end of the day, a tech shouldn't still be leaving a ticket in progress overnight unless it was specifically they were still working, so to speak. That didn't happen very often, but we really wanted them to look at what was scheduled, what needed to be scheduled, what got orphaned or left out in the wild,
Mm-hmm.
those, and then, how do we handle that? And we started off with three. We added the fourth. It worked out pretty well for the most part. Obviously, some days were worse than others, and we kind of tried to track that. But really setting it up for the next day. Like, you didn't want to snowball, and that happened often when you weren't paying attention, and next thing you know it's 4 o'clock and you have 20 tickets that didn't get hit
Right.
because they were past time.
Yeah, I love it. And it's really all about having just a few metrics,
Uh-huh.
not nothing crazy, but things that you can, I think, manage to zero is a really good goal for dispatch. Because when you see your dashboard, whatever your dashboard happens to be, and you got a couple ones or two or three on there, that that needs to be dealt with. And if you see a bunch of zeros, you know that everything is fine. And it gives everybody a sense of, okay, there's not like this pending mountain of work that's sitting out there too. I think that's a really important
Yeah.
thing to think about.
I will say that when we put our dispatch process in place and we actually had somebody paying attention, like actually paying attention, really looking at things. I mean, our time to resolution almost cut in half because things were just getting left. The texts were, once again, answering phones and picking and choosing. And so something might get left in progress and it was already finished. And so it really, honing that in really just made, we probably, our time to resolution probably was already that low, but it wasn't trackable. We couldn't show our clients that. It was
Sure.
like over 30 hours. And so we put it in our process and really started honing it in and getting it dialed in. And it cut down to, below 20 hours, and it got down to 14 time average time to resolution across the company. And if you think about how much you're paying each person, that's a significant amount of efficiency back. And I
Sure.
think anytime you have a dispatch process, it's going to gain you back efficiency.
Well, yeah, because if you think about, if, let's say you have a dispatch process, but you don't have a dispatch person and
Mhm,
you've got a handful of techs. Well, guess what? Someone's doing some version of dispatch,
mhm.
and the likelihood of it being your service manager is pretty high. You're paying your service manager probably quite a bit more than you'd pay a dispatch person. And if that service manager has to do a bunch of ticket management, it's a little bit like your level three having to do a bunch of password resets. They will do it for a time, but if there isn't a an off ramp on the man just managing the ticket situation, that service manager may be looking for a job someplace else as well.
Yeah, I will say that we had that. I see that multiple places in peer groups where they're like, oh yeah, the service manager's dispatching, and I'm like, okay, let's work this out. Let's think this through, and then they realize, okay, well they could be doing X, Y, and Z, and they're not, and that could even get us more efficiency. But now, if I just hired this person, the ROI is definitely there if you look at what everybody's spending time on to have a
Absolutely.
dispatcher.
Absolutely. So, real quick before we wrap up our podcast today, I also want to talk just for a minute about AI tools and dispatch as well, because obviously AI is super prevalent out there, and there's always new tools coming, and there's AI tools that will profess the moon to you. And my thought around AI tools as dispatch is probably not necessarily to replace dispatch, but certainly to augment and make that dispatcher's life a little easier. But Natalie, what do you think? Like, what's on your mind as it relates to AI and dispatch tools and all those kinds of things?
Yeah, something that comes up a lot in peer groups and and it's all over the place because AI in that role is very new
Hmm.
or newer. I see it multiple ways where AI can be used just to triage and make sure the ticket is set up. Even we have one peer group member that's using a chat bot just to respond back to the first parts of the ticket, which is fabulous, right? You can get that, but I think that it's definitely a supplementation right now because you you have to have a process first anyway in order to have some like a AI do it. But there's still that humanity behind it. Being able to reach out to the client, say, "Hey, is this finished? Is this whatnot? Let's talk this over. Make sure everything's smoothed over if it was cranky." And I think you can use workflows and AI and things to do what I call the small tasks, the check boxes, like does this ticket look like it's finished, and have it evaluate the ticket like Halo does that. It gives it a score
Yep.
based on the notes and stuff, and then you're only looking at the ones that are one off. So I think it's more right now about using it to supplement your dispatch process, especially if it's dispatch in the infancy. Once you grow, I think it can become a lot more intricate as you know your process is better.
Yeah, I like that, and I think for me, if I'm thinking about AI and the how the tools will evolve, right? Because the tools will get better over time. Is I am a fan of having your dispatch person, especially if they are able to get their work done, in a timely manner, and if these AI tools are able to help them, even make it go a little faster, is maybe you have this dispatch person help with some of the project stuff because project management is to a degree dispatching at maybe a little bit higher level. So maybe you can have them work in that capacity a little bit as well. Or maybe your dispatcher starts heading towards maybe team lead of your tier ones or something like that. There's a number of different places you can help grow that role into something that is a little bit different than just a traditional dispatcher. Because at some point, you need to have really good client service. If you don't take care of your clients, you won't have an MSP to call home anyway. So make sure that you're leveraging the dispatcher and whatever tools, whether it's AI, automation, or something else, to deliver good client experience, because that probably is the litmus test that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I say it all the time. Ultimately, an MSP is a customer service company that just uses IT and technology to solve the solution. That customer service is still the top priority at that point.
Absolutely. All right. So with all of that, let's go ahead and land this plane. So dispatcher stuff is good. We like dispatchers. We like the process. Have a process defined really, really well, and know that it's going to evolve over time. Now, if you have a dispatcher or would like to get your dispatch person some training, we actually have a peer group specifically for dispatchers at PAX 8. So if you are looking to level up your dispatcher's ability to do their job and get things done, let us know. We would happily bring them into our dispatch peer groups here at PAX 8, and it's run by the amazing Amanda Glidden, and it's about all things leveling up that role, and for them. I think it's a little bit of group therapy too, because they're having to deal with frustrating people all of the time. That's basically who they talk to. So giving them a little bit of an outlet is also a really good thing to do. So with that, thanks for coming along with our tales from the trenches today, and we'll hope to see you next week.